Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar titled School Defense, How to Develop a Safe and Effective Armed Security Team. My name is Mike Smock. I'm a co-founder and run business development for Distributed Security. I'll be your host and MC today. And before we get started, I just want to make sure we have our comms dialed in here. So to that end, I'm going to go ahead and unmute all of the staff. And if you could then make sure, fellas, that you have muted yourself on your end. And then when you're ready to speak, you'll just be able to unmute from your control panel. So if you can go ahead and mute yourself. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. And let me start with today's agenda. I'm going to do the introductions, tell you a little bit more about distributed security. And then I'm going to hand it off to Bill Talon, who is going to do most of the heavy lifting today. Beyond that, the topics that Bill's going to be talking about specifically will be guns in schools. We'll be talking about a couple of, or one case study in Wyoming. And then we're fortunate to have Bill Rogers from Michigan to talk about what's currently going on in Michigan. They'll both be talking about efforts within those two states. And then very importantly, we'll talk about next steps, and how to form a security team and how to go about defending your school, church, and any other community property that requires defense. So with that, let me tell you a little bit more about distributed security. You're going to see this tagline used throughout today, and if we do go any further, you'll hear us talk about decentralized threats. And from the standpoint of decentralized threats, coping with decentralized threats require distributed security solutions, and that's what we're all about here. We are the creators of what we call distributed security networks, which are various combinations of businesses, schools, churches, and other community groups who get together and collaborate in order to defend against violent threat. We offer distributed security, offers a turnkey package of services, including infrastructure, training, provisioning, and outsourcing to businesses, schools, churches, and other community groups. We'll tell you more about that in a follow-up email after the webinar today. The company itself was founded in 2010. We currently operate with a staff of 20 instructors and administrative employees. We're located outside of Chicago. Last month, we announced that we'll be relocating our headquarters to Detroit, Michigan. And we'll also be constructing a 50,000 square foot tactical training center in downtown Detroit. On the webinar today, we have several staff members and advisors. As I said, Bill Talon will be doing the majority of the lift today. Bill is our subject matter expert when it comes to school defense. Along with him will be Ron Danielowski, who is a co-founder. Ron is Executive Vice President and Chief Instructor. Randy Bartlett and Dr. Chuck Gabor are also online to provide support. Bill Rogers, who is an advisor to the corporation, is a former representative, state of Michigan. He was the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee on the Education subcommittee, and he has had quite a bit of experience in dealing with both the political side of the conversation that we're having today, and then more specifically how that applies to schools. So Bill will be here to provide his input and his advice. Last but certainly not least is Rich Selmeyer out in upstate New York. Rich is one of our certified instructors. He is a retired New York State police trooper, and we have a fairly large contingent on the call today from New York. Rich will be here to help us out with any questions and or comments relative to what's currently going on in the great state of New York. You can find detailed resumes on all of us on our website. Needless to say, we do know what we're doing. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hand it off to Bill Tallon. Bill is going to do most of the actual content for the webinar. We have about 45 to 50 minutes of content here. We will open it up for questions at the end. If you have a question during the webinar itself, you can use the panel down there for questions. You can post the panel. We will have people monitoring it. If possible, we'll try to answer it during the webinar. If not, we'll answer it at the end. So please don't be shy about asking questions. And then also about 1 hour after the close of the webinar, everybody will be getting an email, a follow-up email that will contain links that we may talk about here in the webinar, along with where you can go in order to get additional information. So all that will follow once the webinar is closed out. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand off control here to Bill Tallon, who will pick up the webinar. And Bill, they have made you a presenter.
Very good.
There you
Can
go.
See my screen. All right.
Yeah.
Greetings, everybody. I'm going to jump right into the content here because we have a fair amount of it. As Mike said, if you have questions, please jot them down or put them in the chat section on your control panel, and we'll get to them as we can. I'm going to start right here with this question: should schools provide immediate response to armed intruders? And here are the facts that lead us to answer very emphatically yes. The first fact is this: school shootings are almost always planned and prepared in advance with intimate knowledge of the target. They are not impulse crimes. Second, most school shootings are over within 5 to 10 minutes. During that time, there's an average of one more victim every 6 to 8 seconds until the shooter decides to stop. Third, the law enforcement response time to most schools in America averages 5 to 10 minutes. And that is, in fact, arrival on the scene. It does not account for the time required to orient to the situation, locate the shooter, enter the building, move to the shooter's location, and neutralize him. So finally, we come to this unfortunate conclusion, and that is that law enforcement has a poor record of stopping school shooters because they are subject to the tyrannies of space, distance, and time. They simply do not get there in time. So what do we mean by immediate response? It is the response that occurs within the 5 to 10 minute gap between a 911 call and police arrival on scene. That gap can only be closed by armed personnel on site who can immediately confront a killer. Their very presence on site constitutes a powerful deterrent, as you'll see in a little bit. School resource officers, the most common title for uniformed law enforcement in the schools, are both expensive and they are an uncertain solution, as we saw, unfortunately, down in Parkland, Florida recently, and even as long ago as Columbine in 1999. The most viable alternative that we have is voluntary concealed carry by trained and authorized school personnel, and that's what we're going to be focused on most of the day. Some always refuse to believe that this can happen here in their location, but you cannot afford to wait until it does. It's only a gun-free zone until the day someone with no regard for the law brings a gun and starts shooting. Now, some want to believe that other measures can take the place of armed defenders on site, but although they can contribute to a security solution, they cannot solve the problem. You will encounter, especially at the local level, lots of doubts and reservations about this solution. You'll see that some staff will simply not be willing to be armed, and that is entirely fine and reasonable. Only volunteers should be considered. And this is a workable solution because you only need a very small percentage of your workforce to provide that armed deterrent and that armed defense on site. 5 to 10 individuals in any school building would provide flexibility, redundancy, and mutual support should an incident occur. Why do they work? Well, they work because school staff are dedicated. They're highly motivated because in the event of an incident, they're going to be directly in the line of fire. And they are some of the best adult learners of new skills and concepts. The whole subject of firearms and introducing firearms into an environment like a school is very scary for some people. But nationwide, there's a record of safety and discretion on the part of concealed carry permittees that is very, very persuasive. They are the most law-abiding subset of the United States population. And as a school board or a school administration or a governing authority for schools, you certainly have, in almost every case, the authority to require any additional training that you feel appropriate. And what we found around the country is that once armed personnel are in place in the schools and the buzz dies down, things quickly return to normal and nothing happens. In many states where this approach has been taken, the interest and acceptance was really slow at first. I've heard this from correspondents in several states who speak about the passage of bills through their state legislature enabling armed personnel in the schools. And they report in several cases, no one opted in, no one implemented those laws in the first year they were in place. Movement was very, very slow, but once it begins, a trickle turns to a flood, and more volunteers appear, and more districts opt in every year. But we have to start here with the legal constraints, and this is the primary legal constraint on putting any armed personnel into your school, and that is the Federal Gun-Free School Zone Act of 1996, which unequivocally makes it unlawful to possess a firearm within 1,000 feet of any public, private, or parochial school in America. Now, we can somewhat cynically note that this may be one of the most under-enforced laws in the nation because 1,000 feet is a fairly wide radius, and people driving by on the street with a legally concealed handgun or a hunting rifle in the rack are technically in violation of this law. But nonetheless, firearms in school are prohibited by federal law. There are, however, exceptions, and the primary exceptions are, as you see here, for on-duty law enforcement officers, for anyone contracted by the state to carry a firearm, basically contract security guards, and for anyone licensed by the state, in the words of the statute, to carry a firearm. And what the courts have determined is that this license can be a concealed carry permit if the state law governing that permit explicitly allows carry on school grounds. This is the exception used by many states to authorize firearms in schools. Now, there are a lot of variations on this, but this is the elephant in the room, so to speak. This legal constraint is the one that every school or every school district has to take head on before you proceed with any attempt to arm defenders on your premises. Your legal counsel are probably the best equipped people to sort out the legalities that apply in your particular state and district and jurisdiction. And these are the people that you will have to consult and have to obtain their buy-in before you proceed. At this point, I would like to ask Bill Rogers to weigh in a little bit because Michigan is taking their own approach to this legal problem with a bill that is in their legislature currently. Bill, do you want to speak to that briefly?
Thank you, Bill, and welcome everyone. Currently, through a recent conversation with policing agencies, we are here in Michigan to the point of these constraints. The law enforcement is allowed to open carry or conceal, and actually the public can open carry only, but must have a CPL license, concealed permit, though they can't conceal then. As a result of most of the recent incidences, there are a couple of pieces of legislation, and really they focus on being able to arm teachers, staff, but only after a well-executed training. And then there's going to be continuing ed if the bill stays as such. As we all know, having been in the legislature, that can change. And all of you, I highly recommend, if you have information towards that, is please let us know, as we have to follow up almost on a daily basis to see what the trend is through committee and then ultimately to a House and Senate floor here in the state of Michigan. So that's the new bill is, as it is written right now, is looking at 80 hours of training minimally, and also then renewing every 2 years. So they are making sure that the folks are really well trained, and still, as we all know, it's maybe difficult because a lot of people, as mentioned earlier, may not want to get involved with that. They may not feel comfortable with that, but that's what we're hoping through all of the training processes, that we can work through that and make sure that everyone is comfortable, to include those that are not carrying as well as those that are. Turn it back to you, Mr. Bill.
Very good. Thank you, Bill. Let's take a quick look at what's going on elsewhere in the United States right now. The interesting fact is that 14 states currently have laws on the books that allow concealed carry of firearms by school staff members at the discretion of the local school board or governing authority. A very good example of that is the state of Ohio. Their law has been on the books since 2013. And currently they have over 1,000 teachers and other school staff who have all completed training and are carrying concealed in their schools currently, in somewhat over 1/4 of the districts in that very populous state. Other states that have this legal authority don't have that level of participation. And in fact, they include some states like Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Hawaii that we can probably all safely assume do not have large numbers of people authorized for concealed carry, but the authority does reside at the school board level, and the legal provisions are in place. 10 more states, in addition to those 14, allow concealed carry by school staff and other citizens as well, under many different variations, but usually in those other 10 states, they still require individual authorization by the local school board. An interesting example in that category is the state of Utah, both an example and an exception to that last rule, because in Utah now for 19 years, any resident of the state with a Utah concealed carry license is free to carry a firearm on any primary, secondary, or post-secondary school in the state. And they do so without notifying the governing authorities and without permission from them. And there has not been an incident in a Utah school in those 19 years. There are currently at least 3 other states, Michigan, as Mr. Rogers just pointed out, Pennsylvania and Florida, who have bills pending in their legislatures currently. So no one is breaking new ground on this. We have a very extensive history of various methods and paths to make this happen. And here are the results. Our research from DSI indicates that in schools around the country where staff and or other citizens legally carry concealed firearms, there have been no mass shootings. There have been no wrongful shootings. There have been no accidental shootings, and no guns have been taken away from teachers or other staff. So here's a path forward for a school or a district who wishes to proceed. We've spoken of the need, we've spoken of the feasibility, so now let's talk about how to move forward. First, there are a couple of prerequisites that have to be met. You have to ensure that the legal authority to proceed exists, and you have to enact a comprehensive and well-considered local policy. And then you can proceed on the plan of action that we're going to recommend, and I'm going to speak to each of those 7 points in turn. The first necessary prerequisite, the legal authority, basically requires that state law must enable the school or the school district, through exceptions to the Federal Gun-Free School Zone Act. Not universally, but the most successful approaches appear to be these. 1, legislation should be specific to schools. This leads to a much quicker and higher rate of success in getting legislation passed and in place. Provisions for local control, allowing school boards to decide on their own authority whether or not to implement the law, is far more politically acceptable than forcing the issue on a statewide basis. And finally, limiting the arming authority to school staff only also seems to ease the process and ease a lot of concerns and worries. There's often very considerable resistance to allowing armed citizens into the schools without notification or prior approval. The Utah solution does not work in many places. So there are both political and tactical arguments that support this concern, and we've seen a high rate of success with states to pursue legislation along these lines. The second prerequisite is to enact local policy, and here are some of the key considerations. I've been very closely involved with this process in the state of Wyoming, and I've watched several school boards tackle this issue now that we have the enabling law in place. A school board or governing authority has to undertake solutions to all these issues. First, of course, cost and funding. Second, the relationship of an armed staff policy to other security programs, because all schools have in some form prevention and detection and physical security and emergency planning, and all of those have to be revisited and integrated into an armed staff policy. Then you have to establish an application approval and review process for your armed employees. That would include setting qualifications and prerequisites, how to take account of supervisory recommendations, tenure in the position, the possibility of drug or alcohol screening or psychological suitability evaluations. Policy will have to address training and equipment requirements. We'll talk about that in considerable detail a little later. You'll have to consider whether you wish to see on-person concealed carry of firearms or use lock boxes or biometric containers to control access to the weapons. You have to consider the very important point of protecting the identity of armed personnel as best you can in order to create that uncertainty in the mind of a potential attacker. You'll have to ensure that you are confident in day-to-day management of your program by your administrative team. You certainly have all the infrastructure in place to enable you to do that, but this is a considerable departure from administrative responsibilities in most schools. You must address close engagement and involvement with local law enforcement and other first responders throughout the process. And you have to establish very strict criteria for the use of deadly force. And as it says here, avoiding mission creep into other security and law enforcement roles. The point here is you are not turning school staff members into police officers. You are not training them to function as law enforcement officers. You are authorizing them to carry a weapon for the sole purpose of defending innocent lives in that gap between the initiation of an incident and the arrival of law enforcement. Now let's move into our recommended plan of action. It begins with the analysis stage. An analysis involves these 4 important steps. DSI has developed a methodology for how to approach this, but here is a quick description of that process as it applies to schools. One, you must conduct a threat assessment that is specific to your location. It characterizes all potential threats on the basis of their likelihood or probability of occurring and their consequence, their seriousness if they do occur. You must conduct an asset evaluation, which essentially means you identify first responders and their response times. You have to ask and be confident of the answer to how long is that gap between the initiation of an incident and the law enforcement response. Out here where I live, we have rural schools that are respectively 30 minutes and 60 minutes away from the nearest law enforcement response. That's extreme when, as we said before, most school shootings are over within 5 to 10 minutes. But even the in-town schools are at risk given the average response times. Then you must conduct a site survey, which is a very complete and detailed characterization of your site or building and its activities. And once all of that is in place, then you conduct a vulnerability analysis, which poses all of your characterized potential threats against the strengths and weaknesses of your site, both now and after any security improvements that you put in place, including armed defenders. The second step in a plan of action is organization of your security cadre. And it begins, once your policy is in place, by soliciting volunteers. And 10 to 20% of your staff volunteering at the front end of your process is a very, very reasonable outcome. You will have to consider the pros and cons of arming instructional versus non-instructional positions. In many jurisdictions, there's considerable resistance or trepidation about arming classroom teachers. And one of the points that is often raised is whether an armed teacher would be free to leave his or her classroom in the event of an incident. And we weigh in on the side that says it would in fact be irresponsible to leave children unattended in a crisis, and therefore in many cases, non-instructional personnel are likely to have greater freedom of movement and might be better candidates for this arming authority. And then finally, you have to apply very consistent criteria in a multi-stage selection process. Primarily, how that's going to break out is you have to evaluate applicants based on your established qualifications and prerequisites. You have to send them to and to pass any necessary mandated screening, such as background checks, drug or alcohol testing, psychological screening, or what have you. And finally, they have to complete training successfully. Then we come to the step that we call provisioning, which means to specify and provide firearms, ammunition, holsters, and ancillary equipment. In a school context, there's really only two possible approaches here. The first one, which we prefer and recommend, is that armed individuals provide their own equipment. You certainly should establish requirements that ensure safety and reliability of the firearm, the effectiveness of the caliber and of specific ammunition choices, and the concealability and security of holsters. And in order to do that, you're going to have to engage some qualified subject matter advisors to help you write those requirements and then monitor compliance. That's expertise that frequently does not occur within an existing school administration team. The secondary approach, which has been taken in some school districts, has lots of potential drawbacks. And the idea here is that the school or the district would procure and issue firearms and other equipment. The primary advantages are that you have standardization of firearms, ammunition, and equipment, and you don't impose a financial burden on individuals who volunteer. But the cons are really of some significance. One, you would need secure storage. Two, you would need a qualified armorer on payroll. You would have to maintain inventory both for your present security cadre and for any future additions. plus parts and spares. All of that essentially means that you would have to establish and man and maintain an armory operation similar to what most law enforcement agencies do. And that is rather outside the scope of what most schools and school districts are willing or able to undertake. And finally, this solution would create a liability exposure for loss or misuse of weapons during non-duty hours. In other words, the teacher or administrator takes a district-owned weapon off of school premises at the end of the day and returns in the morning. The liability exposure for the district, should they lose that weapon or the weapon be misused, might be considerable. And the only way you could avoid that would be to have a mechanism whereby they would draw weapons for the workday and turn them in at the end of the day. And that, again, is logistically very, very difficult in a school context. The next stage in our plan is, in fact, planning. To plan, organize, and rehearse leaders and administrators before, during, and after your armed staff training. The early stages of this do not involve your armed staff at all. They involve assembling your leadership team with key advisors, applying the results of your security analysis, modifying your existing plans. Undoubtedly, schools have emergency and/or active shooter response plans in place, but those plans will have to change to accommodate armed staff on site. You will have to consider and prepare orientation and training for the rest of your workforce, the majority of your workforce who are not going to be armed. And you must, in this planning process, conduct tabletop exercises and rehearsals specific to each building, involving key staff, administrators in those buildings, and first responders. This is a planning process that has to be undertaken to provide the infrastructure for your armed staff before they ever complete their training and go operational. And then we come to training. It will be the responsibility of the school board or governing authority to review and approve any proposed course curriculum to ensure that it aligns with plans and policy. The board or governing authority will have to select the trainer. They will have to ensure that local law enforcement is engaged in this process and invited to observe and participate in training. The authorities will have to schedule and conduct initial training for all of their approved personnel. And then once they complete that training, which will impart the marksmanship, weapon handling, and tactical skills necessary for individuals and for small teams, then those people are going to have to come back into the school system and be trained internally to ensure that their performance will align with the plans and the policy and expectations and guidance that the district has created. You should not expect a contracted training organization to do this, because they are outside of your chain of command and will not be there to monitor and ensure compliance after training is complete. You will have to establish and enforce requirements for recurrent training, addressing frequency and scope and quality. As you heard from Mr. Rogers a while ago, they've looked hard at that in Michigan. And we know that these kinds of skills are very perishable and have to be sustained by recurring training and practice. And then finally, you have to take what we mentioned on the last slide and train the balance of your workforce so that their responses are integrated with the expected responses of your armed personnel. The sixth step in our process is what we call validation. And this is how you test your plans and capabilities against the threats. You conduct validation exercises to test your training plans and policy against realistic threats and realistic conditions. There are many ways to do this, from tabletop exercises and tactical decision games, which are essentially classroom or boardroom activities, to reality-based training, which put your armed personnel and your leadership team on the ground with role players walking through the actual floor plan of their sites. This has to be done as an evaluation. These are tools that you can use as training tools, but using these tools in training is very different than using the same tools in evaluation and validation. You have to repeat these validation exercises on an established schedule, whether it be monthly, semi-annually, annually, or whenever your conditions or your key personnel change. You cannot rest on your laurels and assume that everyone's currency with their skills and understanding will remain current forever. And finally, an important part of the validation process is that you have to follow up all your training events, any actual incidents or near misses, with a formal after action review so that you can identify successes and areas needing improvement. And the seventh step is what we call mobilization. It's what some call the initial operational capability. Basically, what we're saying here is you must complete all the prior steps before you authorize your trained personnel to carry firearms in your schools. Now let's drill down a little bit more into training. There are several approaches that we've seen taken in different states and jurisdictions. One is state statute may mandate traditional law enforcement academy courses of 40 to 80 hours duration. One example of that is the state of South Dakota, where in fact school staff who wish to carry in the schools must complete a full 80-hour program at the state law enforcement academy. You heard from Bill Rogers a little while ago that Michigan is also looking at an 80-hour training requirement. You'll also see in some cases that state statute will mandate a minimum training requirement in terms of hours and or subjects that must be covered, with the assumption that those training requirements will be met by contracting private training organizations. That's the case here in Wyoming and in certain other states. You'll also find examples, Colorado being a good example of this, where training requirements are not specified in law at all, but are mandated by insurance providers. The liability insurance pool that provides insurance for almost every school district in Colorado has provided guidance to those school districts saying, we are fine with armed personnel in your schools, and your costs will not increase by $1, but we insist that all armed personnel complete this training program. And then finally, there are cases where training is left entirely to the school or school district discretion. And you have examples where no training beyond state concealed carry requirements exist. In the state of Utah, there's one set of requirements for concealed carry permits, and there is nothing further required for anyone who wishes to carry in their schools. Some states, Idaho is one, Michigan may well be the other, depending on how this the final form that their legislation takes. They create a secondary category, often called enhanced concealed carry, that imposes additional training requirements over and above what the average permittee has to meet. Here at DSI, where training is our business, we recommend these minimum training requirements: 24 to 40 hours of initial training and 12 to 16 hours of mandatory annual recurrent training. We also insist that consistency is very important, that all your personnel should complete the same training and train together as teams in groups. And at this point, I'd like to invite my partner, Ron Danielowski, our chief instructor, to talk briefly about how DSI would address training with our own established curriculum. So it convinces us that these minimum hours can in fact meet. Ron?
Yes, thank you, Bill. I appreciate it. What we do at DSI is we take a look at really how human beings learn, and we try to do what we call chunking our curricula into digestible pieces, parts that will actually take a student who has never handled a firearm or had limited exposure to firearms, give them information in a manner that allows them to rapidly accumulate that information and transition it from that short-term memory into long-term memory. It gets kind of technical from here, but the bottom line is we use a very specific method of addressing specific techniques that we're going to teach the students, specific ideas that we're going to teach the students in a very structured manner. Things are presented in a manner that allow them to learn quickly. And in the beginning, what we call that Tier 4 training, that's where most of that work goes on, is just learning the basic gun handling skills and the principles that are needed for an individual to succeed in a fight for life. In our Tier 3 training, then, we bump that to the next level, as Bill has been talking about, which is our reality-based training, which deals with the stress inoculation and other enabling factors that we'll talk about at a later time, but allows a person to then learn how to operate using those skills they learned in that Tier 4 in the gun handling, how to use that in a high stress environment and go from a reactive state, someone who is receiving action from an adversary, to learning how to flip that into a active state where they're actually causing their adversary to react to their actions. And that has to be done under stress. And it's rather complicated, but it is much easier on the student's end, because I'm trying to give you some technical information on the back end of this. And while it does sound difficult, and it does need to be practiced in a specific manner, it can be done rather quickly. So as Bill has mentioned, that can happen anywhere from 24 to 40 hours in that initial training, that Tier 4, and another 12 to 16 hours of that reoccurrent training, which would include both the Tier 4 and that Mod 3 course. But that's also backed up by a lot of the students' own practice. And, that's one thing we emphasize greatly is the students' need. We have a whole system in place for that, what we call the training notebook that backs that up. All their training backs up all the drills they're shooting, whether it's what we call dry practice training with a dry firearm that is unloaded, or whether it's actual firearms using them in a live fire environment. Then that's all documented for the students' benefit, both for their ability to climb that scale quickly, as well as giving them some legal documentation on the training they've been taking. So I'm not going to take up any more time. I'll be able to answer all those questions for you a little bit later after this. Bill, I'll turn it back over to you. And if I missed anything, please prompt me.
Thanks, Ron. I'm going to show you, everybody, I want to show you 3 slides here as an example of training requirements at the level at which a school or school district should address them in policy or in regulations accompanying and fleshing out policy. And I'm not going to read through these slides. You will have them later for reference, but this does indicate the level of detail that we think is appropriate at the policy level. If you are in fact attempting to address your training needs with private organizations, this gives them a very clear outline of requirements that their training curriculum will have to meet. So as you can see, we address live fire training, scenario-based training, and finally in the 3rd slide here, annual recurrent training. And then let me speak very briefly about this, the cost of training. Training organizations like our own, purveyors of quality firearms and tactics training, meeting the kind of requirements that were just on those last 3 slides, will typically charge between $1,000 and $3,000 per participant. And recurring training will likely be priced proportionately. May seem like a lot of money, but it's not. the cost is very low compared to hiring school resource officers at an average of $90,000 worth of salary and benefits every year. For 1 year's salary for a single school resource officer, you could provide the one-time initial training for up to 30 armed staff members. Now, let me speak briefly about Wyoming's experience in this. I've used Wyoming's experience as an example already several times without attributing it. We had several failed efforts to address this in the legislature because we fell prey to the error that I discussed earlier. We lumped school issues into broader Second Amendment issues and attempted to repeal many of the gun-free zones which restricted concealed carry within the state. But every one of those had a constituency and had pushback, and those bills never passed until a year ago when the legislature considered a bill which addressed schools only. That legislation passed with no significant opposition, and its key elements were allowing broad latitude for local school boards, what we call local control. It did establish a minimum training requirement, kind of at the low end of the scale that DSI recommends in the statute, and it mandated very close involvement with local law enforcement. We also had the State Department of Education at that point engaged by convening a committee that developed, I believe it was 27 pages of interpretation and non-regulatory guidance to assist school boards in formulating and adopting policy. And right now we're at the point of individual school boards around the state beginning to draft policy and move towards final passage and adoption. It is now a local political process, and it goes slow in some places and fast in others, but I think everybody is pretty satisfied that it's being addressed at the local level where all the stakeholders have a voice. You'll notice here at the bottom of the page the website of my local school district, which has all of our draft policies that are still under consideration, are available there for download. So if you are interested in proceeding with your own plan, please feel free to go to that website, download those documents, and see if any of the information in there might be useful to you. And then finally, I'm just going to reiterate this very quickly, and that is that there are potential drawbacks. We've seen it in several places. One is free training can be very attractive, but when you have individuals or organizations which offer free training, you have to be careful because sometimes you, in fact, get what you pay for. You must be very careful about the quality of training offered. Things like class size, instructor-student ratio, the amount of range or training time versus downtime for individual participants. You have to be very careful not to short recurrent training because that is key to continued effectiveness and safety. If you proceed with arming personnel, but you don't look at the higher level infrastructure of threat assessments and vulnerability assessments and security analysis, you'll have strong tools on the ground without the plans and understanding in place to utilize them. And you will have no comprehensive security strategy, which is necessary. Armed staff are a big part of the solution to the school security problem. It's not the full answer, and you must integrate it into your other efforts. Now, at that point, I'd like to turn control back over to Mike Smock, who will wrap up our discussion and open up for questions.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Why don't you just flip to the last slide there, to the resource slide. I can talk off of that. Everybody will get a follow-up email in about an hour. There will be links to the resources that we've talked about so far during the webinar that include helping you to potentially craft your own state and or local policy. Both Bill Rogers and Bill Talon can be made available to help assist in that process, beginning with a simple phone conversation. If you want a little bit of help in looking at your current local situation and get any of our advice as to what our thoughts are on where you stand and what you'll need to do. You also will receive in the email detailed information on the training courses that we offer. As Ron indicated, we have several tiers. We have Tier 4, Tier 3, Tier 2 training. Tier 4 is fundamentals. Tier 3 is for individuals. Tier 2 is for teams. And then Tier 1 is for community groups. Any of you online that are currently an instructor, there'll be information in that email about how you could potentially become a certified instructor for DSI. And then last but not least, we haven't touched a lot on the offerings that we bring to the table at Distributed Security. That wasn't the intent of this webinar. We do have a very robust online resource that stands alone and also supports all of our programs. For all of the attendees today at the webinar, there is the ability to join that community for free for 30 days and see what is, see if it will work for your security team. It is designed for church, business, and school security teams. So I would recommend that you take a close look at that when you get the email. That completes the webinar. The content point, I would like to go ahead and open it up for questions. If you have a question, please put it into the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. The first question up is how can we get a copy? I'm assuming a copy of the webinar today. We will produce this and it will be available to all of the attendees. So you will be able to replay the webinar for anybody that might be interested in that replay. Additionally, in working with your local communities, if you have businesses, churches, schools, or other community groups that you feel might be interested in our approach to distributed security, we're always delighted to put on these webinars on a custom basis, a one-off basis for a specific organization. So if you do have anybody that might be interested in that, get in touch with us. And there will be instructions in that follow-up email on how to get in touch with us and reach out for those sorts of questions. Okay, do we have other questions from the group? Anything in general, specific? Let's see. How have you combated very resistant communities like I have here in New York? Yeah. Okay, let's, I guess, why don't we start with Bill Talon on that? Bill, perhaps you can share a couple of your experiences there.
Yes, I have. Yes, I've had that experience myself, and I have the scars to prove it. You would not think that Northwest Wyoming would engender that kind of doubt and resistance, but we do. We're like any other community in America. I've also seen this process in a couple of other states. What experience shows is that the concept generally does engender a lot of doubt and resistance initially, but if it is at the local level, you certainly have the avenue for discussion and debate, freewheeling discussion and debate, within a school district or a local area. What tends to happen is that if you have sufficient support in your local community to proceed, what we've seen again and again and again is that it can be a very contentious process getting to the point of enacting policy and scheduling training and proceeding with this sort of a plan. But once it is in place, the commotion dies down rather quickly, because especially if in fact you have followed the ideas and recommendations you've seen here of authorizing concealed carry by school staff only, very little changes once this policy is in place, because no one knows, it is not public information who in fact is armed and carrying. They carry under rules of deep concealment, where the weapons are not seen and identified. Life goes on within the four walls of your school as it always did, and as soon as people sort of settle down past the initial point of implementation, then life goes on, and life goes on with a great deal of security and confidence, because you are, simply by putting armed personnel in your school, you are reducing the probability of an event ever occurring. And certainly a significant part of your community will understand that from the get-go, and those who don't and who have fears and trepidations find that nothing happens. There's no accidents, there's no shootings, nobody takes guns away, and life goes on.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Next questions. Are districts requiring a psychiatric evaluation for armed staff? Bill, you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah. Many districts do. I know here in Wyoming, I know of approximately 5 school districts that are in the process of developing and adopting their policies now, and every one of them is in fact including what we call a psychological suitability evaluation, which is patterned after the evaluations conducted by most law enforcement organizations for their recruits. I know in my career with the federal government, we underwent a psychological evaluation like that every year during our career. But again, the districts that I'm most familiar with are in fact using that as one of their screening processes at the front end of the process only.
Okay, thank you, Bill. I'll take the next one. Have we trained any school teams in New York State? Rich Selmeyer is on the call. We have not specifically trained any school teams in New York State. You're going to be the whole area of providing professional disciplined training for schools is really just opening up. So you're not going to find a lot of folks out there with a deep bench as far as experience doing this. And we have been one of the groups at the forefront here of really taking a deep look at what's required in order to safely and effectively train schools in order to defend life and property. As far as New York State is concerned, we'll include Rich's contact information if you'd like to talk to Rich Selmeyer any more about either activities that I know that he's trying to set up as we talk, and developments as they may occur in the future. Let's see. I'm going to read this verbatim. I'm a 3rd grade teacher and literally the black sheep of my building for Army staff. I'm dealing with people who think we shouldn't have firearms to begin with. I'm concerned that I will not be able to even get this idea to those who would need to approve it. Bill, I'll start, then I'll hand off to you on this. That's a tough row to hoe there. You always have the heckler's veto involved in a conversation like this these days. And if you're not confident that you'll be able to isolate those folks and hopefully deal with them rationally, then this is going to be tough to put through. What we always look at if we get involved in a situation like this is exactly where those threats come from and whether or not the administration and leadership have the backbone in order to stand up to it. So, Bill, do you have anything else to add to that?
Well, I entirely sympathize with what you're experiencing there. We've had similar experience here locally, and we're working slowly through the process. There is no better way to approach it than to try to keep the dialogue open and civil, and answer sentiment with fact. What I would like to do is, if you will communicate with Mike afterwards, I would like to share with you information so that you can access a Facebook page that we have initiated here locally, where we have a great deal of discussion and back and forth on these issues in our local community, and you may find something in there that would help you in pressing forward with the dialogue where you are locally. I know it's hard at the beginning, but I think you may very well succeed if you're persistent and careful in how you approach it.
Thank you, Bill. Next question, will DSI be putting on a church-specific seminar such as this one? The answer to that is yes. We have in the past put on church webinars. We have worked with some church security teams. The concepts relative to working in a church are not that different from working in a school. It all starts from the same pot of intellectual property. Back to what Ron was talking about as far as basic fundamentals, individual movement, and working together as a team. But the direct answer to that question is yes. And we have everybody here. We have your emails, and you will get periodic emails from us on upcoming events, including new webinars. So if you want more than that, again, with the follow-up email there, use the contact information there to ask whatever additional questions that you might have. Okay, next question. I've heard there is technology developed for public areas where equipment can scan for hidden guns. Are you familiar with this, and is it something that schools can purchase and deploy to help their armed staff to more quickly identify a potential threat? Bill?
I have to say that I am not familiar with that technology. I would like to see it. I would like to see it proven before I placed a great deal of reliance upon it. It certainly could be an aid to the program that we're talking about now. Lower technology in that area is the classic metal detector, and as we point out to people who want to set a lot of reliance upon metal detectors, is that they only work if they are monitored and backed up by armed guards. They don't physically stop anyone. So I could see technology like this, if it is proven out, being of some assistance. You'd have to look carefully at the cost versus the benefits and integrate it with your other security measures. And then it may in fact prove to be useful at some point.
Thank you. Piggyback on the third grade teacher, the people who are required to help approve this are currently organizing student walkouts against the NRA. Well, I, as a very smart guy once said, you can't cure stupid. And if you're faced with that sort of an administration and leadership, you're not going to get anybody to touch this sort of an approach. Our only recommendation at that point is probably to move. Bill, unless you have something magical up your sleeve.
Well, no, unfortunately I don't. But I would say this. Something else that we've seen in several states that have enacted the enabling legislation is that sometimes it simply requires patience, because in almost every state, and I think we could take New York as an example, attitudes in parts of upstate New York are going to be considerably different, as all of their political attitudes are, compared to folks down towards the city. What you'll find is that in most states, there will be a few districts, perhaps slowly, perhaps tentatively, but they will move forward on this. And that changes the dynamic, because then 6 months from now or a year from now, you will have a handful of districts which have moved forward with armed personnel, and the sky has not fallen and no one has been shot. And then you will have constituents, even in areas perhaps like your own, where there's a lot of resistance to the idea. That constituency begins to say, well, their children over there are worthy of armed protection, but ours are not. And attitudes begin to soften, and some people begin to come around to actually considering the more rational aspects of this proposal. So take heart. You may not be able to be in the vanguard of this process, but you may find that other districts around you do move forward, and that's something that will help you in the future.
Thank you, Bill. Okay, more on the technology piece. We'll come back to that in a second. Thank you guys for information. Okay. We've got time for maybe one or two more questions if anybody else wants to post them. We had a follow-up on the equipment question. Bill, the equipment I heard about doesn't require a person to look at a screen to view or monitor. Its technology where a computer identifies by itself hidden guns and then sets off an alarm to the appropriate personnel. I'll try to find where I read about it and provide it to you if you wish.
I would be very interested in seeing that. I can see some potential for that. I must confess, I personally tend to be a little bit of a Luddite. I'm very hesitant to place too much reliance upon complicated technology, but I'm always receptive to the idea.
If I could just point something out real quick. While that technology is great, it's not going to stop what's about to happen. It's going to have to be somebody on the ground. The Boyd's decision-making process, the OODA loop, has not been stopped by that piece of equipment. So time is still ticking, folks. The best it can do is notify your first responders. And I know everybody knows the first responders by police and medics, but the real first responder is the person on the ground. The best that alarm can do is notify those first responders, and I would absolutely want that in place. I would love that in place, but it's not going to stop a guy who's determined to do something really bad. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Okay, unless somebody else comes through here with a question real quick, I will go ahead and close out the webinar. Thank you for your time this afternoon. As I have now said several times, everybody will get a follow-up email here about an hour after we shut this down. You also will have access to a webinar replay. By all means, please share that webinar if you would like with other folks in your community. And while we've talked about schools today, we also offer similar services for businesses and for churches, and I would highly recommend that you spend some time looking at our concept for distributed security, specifically distributed security networks, and how businesses, churches, and schools can collaborate together on a profitable basis in order to deliver local security. Thanks again. Stay frosty, and hopefully we'll be talking to everybody in the future.